Good evening and welcome to the August 15th, 2023 meeting of the Elementary School Building Committee. We will quickly go over the agenda and then get right into things. Tonight we will have public comment. We've added what will be a standing item to our meeting agendas given kind of where we are in the project, which is updates on public engagement, because that is ever increasing and ever important at this stage of the project, so we'll have that on every meeting. Then we'll get into some business. We will review and approve both meeting minutes and invoices. We will discuss a couple of public meetings we've had with the abutters of Hayden Row, as well as our public forum. We will review and discuss the much anticipated cost estimates and talk about the total project budget draft that will be presented to us tonight. We'll have some opportunity to make some decisions on cost management and then talk about our next steps and upcoming meetings. Before we get started, I did just want to acknowledge a new face at the table, David Broninger, who started in July as the new principal of Elmwood School and therefore is probably pretty interested in the goings-on at this meeting, is joining us, so welcome. Appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. Okay, so first is public comment, but we do not appear to have anyone in the audience for public comment tonight, so if somebody shows up, we can obviously entertain opening that back up. Next is updates on public engagement. I'm going to actually fold the abutter meeting and the public forum discussion into this topic too, since it's public outreach. So from a chair perspective, last week on the 8th, myself, Jeff, and Norman Kamalo met with residents who live on Hayden Row in the corridor that is likely to be impacted by the roadway improvements as part of this project. We communicated with 17 residents that are in the affected area. I delivered letters to them. 5 of them attended the Zoom meeting. We presented the schedule of the project and the detail of the current proposals, while letting them know that at this stage that they were proposals that we were exploring, wanting to get their feedback. The residents expressed several concerns that included safety impacts of widening the road, mitigations for the new driveway into the new school for the people who are immediately on either side of it, accessibility of their driveways with the new left turn lane that's proposed, and sort of general disruption caused by the potential traffic light. There were also concerns raised about stormwater impact, and we promised to follow up about that, as we know we've talked about that here at these meetings. We answered all their questions. We're providing the full traffic report to these residents as a follow-up, and we agreed to make sure that we will have regular meetings with them to discuss the progress, how we can address some of their concerns, and give them more detail. Overall, I think they were appreciative of the conversation. Obviously, living on that corridor, they have experienced a ton of disruption when it comes to road work, so I can't say they were excited to hear about more, but we will continue that dialogue. Jeff, I don't know if anything to add on that.
No, you hit it out. We also made commitments to them that even in and during construction, we will have boots on the ground, same as we have in other projects, and so they'll have a regular liaison should they have an issue during construction. And so they were appreciative of that, and knowing that this was the start of a long conversation and that regular engagement that you discussed.
Yep. Any questions about that? 2 days later, we had our public forum. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 residents attended the public forum. It varied as we went through. It was a Zoom meeting, so people kind of popped in and out. We presented on the traffic report, the MSBA reimbursement process, the current environment around construction costs, and the HVAC and mechanical systems. We were also going to present on the potential solar plan and impact on the building, but we ended up kind of cutting that on the fly because we were running short on time and wanted to allow sufficient Q&A time. So we received and answered questions about the collaboration with public safety that we have had on the traffic and mitigation efforts, the potential use of Center School and why that was not viable as a place to house students temporarily, about renovating and expanding Elmwood and why that was not a preferred option for the school solution, And then questions were also raised about the enrollment projections used to size the school, which Dr. Kavanaugh, I know, answered very thoroughly in terms of how we've arrived at those projections. And then finally, we also had questions about why the geothermal system was being proposed over a natural gas system, and how long it would take the system to pay for itself, which we explained not only some of that timeline, but also the impact of the reimbursements that we're gonna get. Again, I think generally speaking, I'd love to have more people in the Zoom, but hopefully people are watching it after the fact. And we are getting a really good volume of questions from the people who are attending, so the engagement level, I think, is good in helping us shape our messaging to the broader community. So any other thoughts or questions about that?
There was one other comment that was brought up, which was the question of whether one school on a new lot is cheaper or more expensive than two separate schools. And I think that's appropriate to tonight as we get into the presentation we have on costs.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and Chris, I thought you answered that well in terms of where some of the efficiencies are in having one school, in addition to the MSBA process. You know, really they're only reimbursing on one project at a time, so if we were building two schools, we'd be probably losing money there as well.
One other comment about the reason the PV photovoltaics got cut short, as we were trying to be respectful of time, is the proposal that's going in front of the group tonight does not have photovoltaics within the roof, so it's not part of the funding that's going in front of town meeting, so that's why we decided to cut that. It was more about the education and the potential for photovoltaics, and the school is interested in pursuing that as they have in other buildings in town.
Thank you. Yeah, the photovoltaic panels, we could have included those in this proposal, but the way the town has operated on other buildings in the past is to use a power purchase agreement, and the anticipation is they would use the same thing, so we wouldn't include that in this process. It's not, when people don't see solar panels on this plan, it's not because we don't expect there to be solar panels, and we are in fact designing it to house solar panels. Yesterday, as I mentioned to the committee for your information in an email, I did have an interview with Hop News about the project overall. The interview has been posted. And then last thing on things that I have received, I did receive an email from a resident about our recent meeting schedule. There was a question about the meeting that we had last Friday. This was a posted public meeting, as all of our meetings are, and the purpose was to give ESBC members a familiarity with the format and content of the construction estimates that we'll be reviewing tonight. Since many of us aren't familiar with those, we thought it would make the conversation much more efficient and effective if we could understand that and have an opportunity to think about our questions in advance of the meeting. She was also looking for the agenda for tonight's meeting, as it was not yet on the town website. I forwarded it to her and confirmed with the town clerk's office that tonight's meeting was posted in accordance with open meeting law, so we're all set there, and it has since been added to the town website. Last thing on this section is the website and frequently asked questions. The frequently asked questions is something that we've been in strong need to update for some time. I circulated to the committee a question or a sample document. So if there are any questions or feedback that we want to discuss here on any specific questions, we can do that. Otherwise, please get me feedback directly so we don't have an email conversation, and we will get that posted as soon as possible. The one question that probably is a little bit tricky is the discussion of the tax impact and cost. And so I tried to Bill did a really thorough job of providing the information and answering that question, and I somewhat paraphrased the information. So if anybody has any thoughts or concerns about that, because it is a little bit more of a difficult to nail down answer. Okay, so, I was gonna say I can stop talking, but I can't because we have to do minutes and
Pay some bills.
pay some bills. So, let's get to that. Let's start with minutes. So the first minutes we have are the minutes from the June 5th, 2023 meeting. Does anyone have any comments or questions about those minutes? Okay, hearing none, I would seek a motion to approve the minutes of June 5th, 2023.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, motion by Mike, second by Shahadul. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, and so it passes unanimously, and it is 7-0. The next, oh, that's the same one. June 13th, thank you. So the next minutes are June 13th, 2023. Any questions or comments about those minutes? Okay, again, hearing none, I'll seek a motion to approve the minutes of June 13th, 2023.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Okay, motion by Mike, second by Jagroot. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, so that is also unanimous. And where did I put my, can I have that back, Susan? I can't find my electronic copy, so I need the amounts. See, that's what I get for being efficient and signing it quickly. Okay, we have three invoices to pay tonight. The first one is to Vertex, invoice number OPM 116-16 in the amount of $9,170. The second one is for Perkins Eastman, invoice number 95420-00.0-11 in the amount of $77,999.48. And the third is to WJ Deanna Backhoe, invoice number 2016376 in the amount of $5,400. And just a reminder that that one, because that's the unusual one, is for the clearing that was done for the test well, which we'll talk about later. So total amount in the invoice package is $92,569.48. Any questions or comments? Okay, then I would seek a motion to approve the three invoices totaling $92,569.48.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Okay, motion by Mike, second by Shahadul. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, and it carries unanimously. We can send this back around. And with that, I can really stop talking and turn it over to Jeff or Chris. Who am I turning this over to for discussion of the cost estimates?
Did you want to recap the decisions the committee's made to date, or you would like us to present that?
Oh, yes.
We can do that. Chris has all the slides. So these are the same slides we presented to you guys, both in the May and June and July, I think, meetings, so it's the ongoing conversation. But since we're now concluding the cost, and we have the cost that reflects that, we thought we'd recap it. So the next couple of slides touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go over them, as we discussed like an hour ago and I forgot, but yeah. So some of the key project decisions to date, because what we're gonna do tonight for benefit of everyone who may not be following is we're gonna be reviewing the project cost estimates that will drive our final decisions on the project budget that we will be submitting to the MSBA as part of our schematic design. This number that we submit for the project budget is effectively the number that will be going to town meeting in the fall for approval. So it's important that while there's still more pencil sharpening to be done, that we've done a lot of the sharpening throughout this process. And so just to relatively quickly recap how we got here, the grade configuration decision was one that was made by the school committee that really impacted the scope of our project, and that was to include the fourth grade as part of this new Elmwood project, which maximizes the reimbursement potential that we can get for all of the expansion that we're doing as a school district. So making this a second, third, and fourth grade building, and help us zero in a little bit on the assessment of some of the sites that we had that could accommodate this. We selected the Hayden Row site. We reviewed up to 44 sites, but ultimately over the Elmwood site, and it was really driven by a number of things. The ability to do this project without having to think about swing space where we would have to house students during the Elmwood construction, as well as some of the difficulties in potentially building a second, third, and fourth grade school on that site without having to look into acquiring additional land. From the initial education plan and initial schematic design, We did reduce some of the ineligible spaces. So when we show this plan to the MSBA, they provide feedback on what spaces are and are not eligible for reimbursement. Recognizing the size and price of this project, the school district took a look at what were really the necessary spaces and were able to reduce a lot of the spaces in the initial design that were ineligible for MSBA reimbursement. Thanks to the team at Perkins Eastman, they are constantly looking for improved floor plan efficiency. So it seemed like every single time we came back to a meeting, there were slight changes to the design of the building, reducing jogs, and kind of adjusting for some of those decisions on program, and ultimately reduce the gross building area by about 1,000 square feet, which results in significant cost savings from the construction of the building. We also looked into reducing asphalt and impervious surfaces, which will have, cost savings. We reduced the number of proposed outdoor classrooms and site features. So the outdoor classrooms are obviously designed to enhance the educational model, giving teachers some flexibility to do some lessons outside, get the children out in the natural light more. We think this is really important, but we've also thought that in consideration of the budget, having one classroom per grade level felt right. Probably the biggest one of the biggest cost decisions we had was the HVAC and mechanical systems. We chose a geothermal heating system because it uses the least energy to operate, which is along the lines of where the town is going in improving the net zero resolution that was approved at last spring's town meeting. But the total cost over a 50-year lifetime is estimated to be about $3 million less. We will also qualify for significant rebates from both the Mass Save program and the Inflation Reduction Act, the federal program that was passed last year. So that helps offset the first cost of the full geothermal system as well, making it a lot more financially palatable from that perspective. Probably something that for most of the public is a little bit more inside baseball. The choice of how we're going to build the building between a general contractor model and a construction manager at risk model, we chose the general contractor design bid build procurement model because given the size of this project, that was recommended to us as an effective way to manage the construction of this project, and it also has the added benefit of being significantly less expensive. Our material selections, we went through all exterior and interior materials, kind of almost wall by wall, and chose cost-effective materials, weighing the initial cost, but also against future maintenance costs, so that we make sure that we're not building a building inexpensively that's going to cost a lot more to maintain the materials going forward. And then probably an add to the cost. We're currently carrying the traffic changes to Hayden Row in the cost estimate, even though the committee hasn't sort of finally landed on exactly what we're going to do with that. The changes that were recommended by the traffic engineer were significant. At this stage, we're keeping those in the estimate while we'll have time over the fall to figure out exactly what we do and don't want to include. And then today, we'll be doing some final scoping. So Vertex and Perkins will take us through some of the decisions that we still have in front of us to drive towards that final project budget next Tuesday.
Thanks, John. So what we're going to review today is the schematic design estimate. There was a package of drawings and narratives that you all received that outlines the intended design that this budget is based on. The intent of today is to set a budget, not choose a design. There will still be decisions that will be made over the course of the project, should this move forward, that this committee will make to end up with the end design. But today's really about using that design as the outline that will follow, and this is the budget that will support that. The budget was, or the estimates were created by two separate cost estimators. They each looked at those packages independently of one another, arrived at a number, and then we met with them to reconcile those two together so that we could end up within 1% of between the two estimators. The values tonight are based on PM&C's estimate, which is Perkins Estimator. The other one was is it AM Fogert?
Okay, and forward here.
And they were the estimator that Vertex brought to the table. And so just a note about the differences between the estimates that we have today and the estimate that we had previously that yielded the $170 million number. The PSR stage, those estimates are largely based on a generalized assumption of what should be within a building of the scope that was outlined at the time. There was some detail provided, much more than was provided at our initial estimate, but it wasn't a detailed design of the parts and pieces that would be provided. At schematic design, there's a much higher level of detail compared to where we were. I think it was 6 drawings versus a fairly significant set at schematic design. And that really outlines a lot of the choices that this committee's talked about and made, and a lot of the design details that Perkins' team has developed to arrive at a number that is much more refined in terms of what it outlines for the building that is proposed. In discussions with the committee last Friday, we arrived that Marathon served as a good benchmark to understand the project that we're getting our design on. So we took a look at what the town approved for schematic design for the Marathon project versus the schematic design that we have today for the Elmwood project. A couple of the things that jump out is that enrollment is about 3 times larger for the proposed Elmwood project versus the originally proposed Marathon School. The community may remember that the Marathon School did increase over time and has continued to increase related to some of the enrollment challenges that Hopkinton faces. But the 3 times larger is an important metric for a couple of reasons. One that we identified is that the Elmwood design, with a lot of the efficiencies that Perkins has introduced, is an extremely efficient building in terms of how it's come together. We noticed this structurally as well as other aspects of the building, made for a very efficient building overall for the number of students that it houses. And one metric of that is we looked back at the last 11 years of MSBA supported elementary schools, and we found that it was 30% more efficient than Marathon, but it was also one of the top 5 most efficient on a gross square foot per student basis compared to a lot of those other schools. So we looked at that in terms of how does that relate to the original Marathon building. And if you take the original construction cost for Marathon, 3 times that, and then increase it by the 36% construction inflation that we covered in the community forum last week, you end up at a construction number of about $143 million. That's important, and we'll come back to why later. The PSR estimate had our construction cost at $135,138,874. The reconciled estimate from PM&C was $124,219,849, which overall was almost an $11 million reduction in the overall cost of the building. We looked at the individual components of the estimate to really understand where some of the big movers were in terms of the reduction, and one of the big ones was that the structure was reduced by about 35%, and that comes from an efficient layout, coming up with straightforward supports designed by the engineer, as well as the fact that the building really builds out of itself very efficiently. We looked at the exterior walls, which reduced about 7% from the assumptions made at the PSR stage. A lot of that has to do with the material decisions that were made by this committee over the course of the project. The interior was reduced by almost 23%. And a lot of that is the efficiency of the layouts between the various classroom wings and how they're organized, as well as a lot of the cost-effective material decisions that this committee made. The mechanical system was reduced about 15%, and a big component of that was right-sizing the well field, which was a discussion that we had with Perkins Engineers, as well as GZA, the new consultant. We'll speak about that in a minute. Overall, those taken together, the building direct costs, which are the costs before we mark them up, reduced about 8%, and the site costs, in addition, even with including the traffic improvements, were down 9% from what we had forecast at the PSR level. And that's given us this overall reduction of the 11 million that we spoke about. We've identified 8 alternates that we'll speak about in a second. So what I'd like to do is walk through the alternates that we've developed after meeting with the estimator and just provide an overview of those, and then the committee can discuss and debate what they'd like to move forward with. The first one that we wanted to speak about is the potential reduction of the geothermal well count. We earlier spoke about how the ESBC had authorized a test well to be performed. And as we've gotten closer to that point, we've identified that a mixture of the fairly rainy summer that we've had, as well as scheduling issues with the driller, have pushed out when we can perform that drilling. As a result, we won't be able to complete it before this report goes out. And with the rules that the MSBA has for the SD report, for the authorization, we won't have an opportunity to revise that number down in terms of what the community votes on. So in discussion with the working group, what we're proposing is to delay that driller until the ground can harden up a little bit and dry out a little bit so that they could perform that at some point in the future. And what we did in order to still be able to right-size the wells is we reached out to GZA, who has done a lot of geothermal work in Massachusetts, and they provided us with their 2 closest well locations, as well as an average of the performance that they've seen in geothermal wells throughout Massachusetts. From those, in discussions with the engineers, it was proposed that we would add a contingency to those number of wells, and that would arrive, and that, when analyzed against the loads that were proposed for the building, we arrived at 120 600-foot wells as the number of wells that was included in the estimate. There is still the possibility, because of the contingency, that that number could come down, or if we have a extremely poor performing well when we do the test well, then that number gives us some buffer so that we could move forward in the future, and either there'd be savings that the town would not need to spend or borrow, or we would not need to come back to the town and say, the wells are too expensive, we need more money. So this puts us in a position of moving forward with what we have as a reasonable place to move forward. And at this time, we wouldn't recommend further reducing that as a cost savings. Any further reduction, as I've outlined here, would be about $47,500. So that would be something that the committee could choose to reduce that, taking on the risk that the test well doesn't perform as well.
Do we want to do these as a individually?
We can do them individually, or we can.
I think probably
as
just
you go through, it's
because,
gonna be
yeah, I
easier.
think otherwise we're gonna have trouble remembering. So if you could put the number 1 back up there, and I wanna open this up for discussion, but it's also worth noting, what a lot of people in town might not realize is we talk about this being a committee of volunteers, but it's also a committee that is put together with specific expertise to help make this process go more smoothly. And so, in particular, this is a great example. Jagroot was really instrumental in asking some of the questions of the engineers in this space, because his professional background allows him to understand this on a level that none of the rest of us around this side of the table certainly can. And even in particular, I think the reason why that number is a 600-foot well versus a 500-foot well was specifically a question that he brought up. So I raise that not only to thank you, but also, again, I think it's illustrative for the community that we've got some real expertise here in how we're building this building. And now I'll welcome thoughts on this change.
Just a quick clarification question. So the reduced number is 120. What was the previous number again?
100.
So we were it was 170 wells at 500 feet. We then reduced to 145, so the drop is from 170 to 145. Then we converted the the 500-foot wells to 200 to 600-foot wells, which then brought the overall well count down to 600 to 120.
Thank you. That
And what's the dollar drop there?
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Millions.
Was it a couple million, I think?
Yeah, like the $47,000 number is a marked up number. Should we choose to take it out later, it's not that exact number, because that has a lot of the contingencies that are layered on at this stage of the project. But any wells you reduce, an actual install well cost from the driller itself is about $34,000, so that's the driller's cost. So any wells we remove later on in the process, it's 34 plus some amount of markup wherever we are in the process.
It's about $1 million for that initial drop, and then we have an additional contingency, a performance contingency, versus the nearest well, I think was in Lexington.
From GZA's workload, yeah.
And then we added a performance contingency in case we saw worse results. And we thought that was an appropriate, conservative way to approach it that limits the risk should we have a poor performing well, but provides the opportunity that we could save money in the future if we have a similar performing well.
Two questions. Number one, we're only drilling one test well, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and obviously that must be industry standard, that one is all you need, that's gonna give you the soil and the conditions in the area.
That's correct.
I did notice, I believe, looking over this information, that you used the word markup. Now, am I correct, it's about 24% markup on this particular item, or is that across the board, or?
So it's across the board for the alternates, because at this stage, although there's detailed drawings, it's still only 30% of the overall design. So when we go into the details of the estimate, you'll see there's a 10% design contingency, there's an 8% escalation, and then there's insurance overhead bond. So that's the 24%.
Okay.
And so when you take it out later, those things filter into where they are, because the escalation goes up and the design contingency goes away. So the pure cost of the well is $34,000. And at a later date, you'd have that plus the overhead profit insurance would be the remaining markup at a later date.
Great, thanks.
Chris, I have two questions. The 47,578 that you mentioned, could you explain how that could, what you mean by could be saved per well? Is that by reducing the contingencies?
So in the event that the performance of the well falls within that contingency, we would provide the number of wells that was appropriate based on the actual test well.
Right.
So if that falls, say, 10% below that number, there would be a proportional reduction in the number of wells. We would still only be providing the number of performance, based on the performance standard, we'd provide the number of wells based on that performance standard to meet the load of the building. The load of the building is unlikely to change unless we make other decisions that would, say, change the insulation thickness or something along those lines as the design evolves. But it provides for a poor performing well and then the number of wells to meet that performance. So wherever that performance lands, that will dictate the number of wells that we need.
So there's some buffer in the number now. You know, we believe that there's still a count that can be reduced, but we're not the engineer of record, and he's waiting for the test well. So when the data is in front of them, then we can have more informed conversation about it.
Yeah, so the only thing I wanted to clarify is that saving could be realized only after we had the test loop data, correct? We've made the decision right now based on the best information.
We've made the decision based on the best information. There's an overall conversation we can have about the right design contingency to carry. Right now, it's 10%. One of the estimators had it at 9%. That's a conversation about overall risk that we could have. You know, you can carry 9.75, right? There are incremental steps that if we felt that the overall estimate was conservative on too many line items, then that number itself, that kind of buffer at the end, could be tweaked down a little.
And like all contingencies, it's risk management. So you're providing for a little extra in the budget to cover the potential risk later. You could just as easily, if the committee wanted to pursue this route, provide less in the budget now, but realize that you have more risk that needs to be covered in the contingency if something were to come up.
And my next question was, is the plan to still use the test loop as part of the ultimate bore field, or
Part of the reason that, the discussion to delay it was the fact that we can get some way towards the site, but we can't get to the ultimate location where we're planning to place the wells. And because we can't get as deeply into the site, it becomes a decision between creating a test well that will give us the information we need, but won't be practical to reuse as part of the project. And so it's a higher cost to pay to obtain that information than if you can reuse that well. So by delaying, we're hopeful that we can reuse that well.
There will need to be an adjustment to the previously authorized funds, because now that we're going 600 feet versus 500 feet, the driller will be out there longer. And so we're working through that, and when is hard enough with that soupy mess back there in some locations, because the rig is long and heavy. So, you know, at some spots, it's a little soft in its current state of the forest mat. So we have open conversations that we have to get through with the driller that we bring back to you guys this fall.
One other quick question. The 11 million savings that you mentioned earlier, is that including these 8 alternates or?
No, that's before these 8
Before these
alternates.
8.
Some of these alternates are increases and some of them are decreases.
And do you have a sum of all these or that you can do
Yeah,
after we make?
we'll be able to.
It'll be
update
step
it
by
live,
step, yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
And actually, I should have probably said this at the beginning. So what are we trying to accomplish tonight, right? So what we're trying to accomplish tonight is to look at these alternates and then look at the total number and give Vertex and Perkins indications of what we feel like we want to go with for the final project budget. So in some ways, sort of providing our final decisions around the budget. We will not be voting on the budget tonight, that's next week. So we still theoretically have some time to make some changes. So as we go through these, we might have a positive view on one of them,
Yeah.
and then when we see a total up at the end, we might think differently of it. So I think going through them individually makes sense, with the idea that we could always loop back if we think that there's a change that needs to be made, once we see the total. Fair?
Makes sense, yeah.
All right, should we proceed to the next one?
Are we good on this one?
Well, I got another question, and I may have missed it. I know the project is a 10% across the board contingency. Was there anything specific on this area that was different? Seems like I remember a
The
higher
well-
contingency on the well.
The well count has a 30%
Yeah.
tonnage capacity, so there's additional wells that, you know, long-term, I think will be able to come out, but we're not the engineer of record, so it's hard to, we pushed to get to this point and, you know, look through the calculations and use data on surrounding projects and other jobs in Mass to get to a comfortable zone. It could be pushed lower, you know, if we weren't under the types of situations that COVID had arisen in years past, I would probably push more at this point, but I think it's a safe spot, you know, where it is now.
No, I just wanted to clarify that for this particular area, it's 30% contingency versus 10.
Yeah,
in
no, it's a great
most of
point.
the
There are
others.
individual line items that have some padding with them outside of the 10% itself.
Good, thank you.
Alright. So as part of our HVAC discussion, back when a system was selected, the committee asked for an alternate that would be an air source heat pump that would offset some of the wells. The designer came up with a 70-ton air source heat pump, and that would offset about 24 wells. So this alternate would be credit, or a reduction of $709,699 for incorporating the air source heat pump and deleting 24 wells. What that would mean is that the efficiency of the building would go down, the EUI would likely raise, there'd be more energy that it would take to operate the building. You would also have an additional piece of equipment that would need to be maintained, whereas the well is a fairly passive system in terms of how it operates. We also looked at, as part of this, what that would do to the Mass Save rebates, and also the IRA rebates, because the Mass Save rebates in particular are based around the type of system that you incorporate. They provide a different incentive for for ground-based heat pumps versus air source heat pumps. And so that difference is $4,500 per ton versus $800 per ton. They also have a little bit of a factor that changes based on where your EUI lands. And so that factors into it as well. So our conservative estimate is that the rebates from Mass Save would likely reduce by about $259,000. And the IRA, which is more based on the 1/3 of the total construction costs, would also reduce by about $240,000. So you would be looking at close to $500,000 of rebates that you would no longer qualify for by selecting the savings of $709,699.
So it's open for discussion, but the question was asked to the committee several meetings ago as a lever that may need to be pulled down the road should value engineering be necessary. So we're not recommending proceeding with it, but this is always in your back pocket. At any point during design, we can pivot and pursue this should other budgetary issues become an issue.
But realistically, what you're saying from an upfront cost perspective, this is worth about 200,000.
Right. And your utility bill will go up too, so it's
Right,
not.
that's an upfront cost, yeah.
And your maintenance bill would go up.
Right. Okay. Questions, thoughts?
So alternate number 3, you may recall we discussed the option of providing an occupied roof outside of the art and the STE rooms. There's a section of roof at the front of the building that overlooks the main entrance. And as part of the cost estimating, we examined 2 potential upgrades. These would be cost increases should the committee choose to pursue them. The first would be to make it a green roof. That would be a planted roof that would be placed on this. It would be visible from the STE rooms and the art rooms on the 3rd floor. And the second alternate would be to make it an occupiable roof. So this would provide room, doors out of those classrooms so that students could use that space for either STE projects or as part of the art curriculum. The increase for the green roof, which was present at the Easton School that we visited, would be $95,353, whereas the increase for the occupied roof would be $244,346.
Can I ask, how is a green roof maintained?
It's considered low maintenance. It's a sedum plant that really, typically comes out of Canada, so it's very hardy, weather resistant. The only maintenance that would be required is if a ball goes up there or trash is thrown up there, but it basically self-adjusts. There's a variety of species, and whatever species is getting the right conditions, whether it's the reflectivity of the windows or the microclimate, that usually becomes the dominant one.
And would there also be doors could you walk on it, or would it just be for viewing? And,
Mostly viewing, you can walk on it.
okay.
You wouldn't want traffic and circulation on it. The original purpose of a green roof is really for an insulation value. And, what we're looking at here is also an educational tool. And for those that don't know, it's also a trade system, so you've got your perfectly fine roof underneath. The trays can be removed at any time or just set in place is what basically is done.
And while the railing would likely be a little more complex, both of these could be something that could be added in the future. The roof can still be designed to sit underneath either the pavers or the green roof.
Speaking for myself and having grandkids that'll be in the school, I don't want them on the roof, A. And B, we had this very same discussion over Marathon School, and they're gonna put a green roof on that. I think given the level of insulation that we have, and it'll come with the school, we don't need green stuff up there to make it warmer. We have plenty of green stuff outside. We have playing fields we're gonna put green stuff on. This, it seems to me, would be an extravagant expense with no practical You guys could all think differently, that's just my 2 cents. And Tim's gonna be taking care of it, so it just seems, you know, be an extravagant expense, it's not worth it. My 2 cents. Feel free to disagree.
I will agree, 100%.
Yeah, the image above is actually Ashland Davis Minda School, so I just took this picture last week while I was out there. We're opening it up, so you'll be able to see that location in all its viewing, but don't disagree with any comments that are stated, but that is a local one, should you choose to look at it. And as Chris noted, it is an easy thing to adjust later. The driver on that, $240,000 is the system itself, and then the railing around it that's there for safety.
I would agree. I think it's nice to have, but when we are cost conscious, it may not be top priority.
I agree too. It's unoccupied, there's not much use to it, and it's an additional cost, so I don't see the point.
So, while agreeing, and I recognize the pressure this is gonna put on this question, I sort of reserve the right to have my mind changed to ask the educational professionals, do you see a use for this that would make you want us to include it?
I think when we went to Easton, it was Easton when we saw a green roof, yes. I think that the maybe only educational piece that we talked about was that some species will, you know, overtake other species, and that might be a lesson for kids, but I don't necessarily know that you want to pay $100,000 for that.
All right,
I mean, it is a nice to have for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
then I think, seems like we're pretty united on that one.
So keep moving.
So alternate 4, this came up in the reconciliation. The HVAC engineer suggested that we can use the same HDPE piping or other plastic, similar fused plastic piping system that is used to bring the water from the geothermal wells into the building. We could use it inside the building. And by using it inside the building, it eliminates the need to insulate those pipes, which is a cost savings, and the piping system itself is a little bit cheaper, which is a cost savings. This was already incorporated into the number, so this is an add alternate to go back to a more traditional steel Schedule 40 piping system. He noted in the reasons why they prefer this that it's not necessary, the increased strength is not necessary for either the temperature or the pressure of the geothermal loop. They don't reach those extremes. He noted that it's easier to maintain and that the chemical treatment works a little bit better on the plastic because the aging of the steel over time doesn't add impurities as easily, or adds impurities more easily than the plastic does. And he also noted that the plastic won't, the insulation cost is significant on this piping. This would be for the mains through the building. And the plastics have been in the marketplace long enough that it's proven that there's a long lifespan. It is not the traditional way to do it in terms of if you had a more traditional, not a geothermal building, which is why I thought it was good to put it in front of the committee so you were aware that this choice was being made. But in the way that the estimate was written, to return to the steel piping would be an increase of $264,320.
Okay. Questions?
Chris, how many buildings is the plastic pipe used in now? Do you guys have any idea? Is it being used?
We don't have an answer for how many it's being used at. We haven't used it, we've been using it in the geothermal wells themselves. And so this is one of the first projects we're seeing them carry it through, but the CMTA has done it before, and so we can come back and get an answer for you guys on that.
Yeah, it'd be good to see how it works out.
In general, what is the rationale, or would be the rationale for 40 steel?
It's the, steel piping is normally how the water is conveyed around the building today, but because we're doing this plastic pipe on the outside, that same water is now running through the building, so the designer is just carrying the same exterior pipe and bringing it into your,
Steel pipe,
but
is
that's
the
a
steel
change
piping,
from tradition, so
Tradition.
that's why I wanna flag it as as an item for you guys to understand.
The steel piping is what will be used in more traditional
Correct.
HVAC systems, so the thought is that people kind of kept doing that because it was the standard, even as they moved to geothermal before somebody figured this out.
Right. So we'll ask CMTA for a list of, where they've done it before in open buildings.
Yeah, if we could flag that answer, do you think we get that answer by next week?
Yeah, I
Okay,
shouldn't
yeah.
have a problem.
And then we
Yeah.
can just quickly bring it back up to make sure that we're comfortable with that before we vote next week. That would be good. Any other thoughts? Tim, I hope you're ready, because I think the next like 4, we're gonna be looking for your input here.
Sure.
So during the interior finish discussion, we discussed the FRP that was used in Marathon as a potential alternative to tile wainscoting within the building. The wainscoting is useful particularly in younger grades, because those grade levels still like to touch things a lot. And it can also be protective of all surfaces, because it's a more protective surface that is at their level. The Perkins Eastman team took your suggestion and came up with a mid-range FRP product that is basically an FRP core, but it's surfaced with a high-pressure laminate, so your typical plastic laminate that you'd be familiar with. And so they have used this successfully, and Bob can speak to this, in other projects. And that is what is called for in the non-public lobby areas. The public-facing main lobby and the second floor, where outside the media center, where we're gonna have the public within the building, is still currently scheduled as tile and was estimated that way. So this would be the classroom wings and the third floor main spine, where we currently have that FRP material with some metal trim pieces to support it. The alternate here would be an additional cost of $144,319 to change that FRP material to tile. So it would be an increase in cost, so that throughout the building you would have a tile surface, which was similar to a lot of the schools that we toured as part of the school tours. I don't know if you want to add to that, Bob.
I can just say that the product that you have in Marathon is not the same as this one. This was used at our career technical education school, Essex Tech. My understanding in all my visits is it's weathered well. The concern with this product, with this one in particular, isn't it itself, it's the joints. So we've specified a specialty joint, the same one we use at Essex Tech. And I think that's the kind of attention a material like this would need, is to make sure that the joints is where, the material can be pulled at, but otherwise the material itself is durable.
Yeah, so just as a frame of reference, and I know we spoke about it a couple weeks ago, I did take another walk through Marathon School, and I'm happy to do a tour if anybody's interested. But we are noticing a lot of bubbling in the current system that we use. That school's about 5 years old. I do anticipate having to start replacing that probably within the next 5 years, as it's bubbling and it'll stop peeling off the walls. So I think an upgrade to that product would be great. I'd like to see maybe a sample of what you're proposing, Bob,
Yeah, and
before, I guess, a decision's made on which way we would go with this.
yeah, and maybe reaching out to Essex Tech, that's about 10 years in.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This is another example where, if we're carrying a 10% design contingency, if we go in with the product that's specified here, there's still an ability at the next 3 estimates to check the market, see where it's at, and decide at that point that's a value add, and balance the overall budget.
Yeah, this is one of those things, so we get the final number, if the number comes out better than what you anticipate, then we got the money to spend on it.
Yeah.
I think at this juncture, we go with what is in the spec. We know what this is gonna cost. If the estimates come back less than we think, this might be one of the items we reconsider. But the whole point of this, when we went over all the materials, was to give something that was gonna be efficient, was gonna be this, was gonna be that, and not go crazy on the cost. We went crazy on the cost on all the public spaces, tile, and I agree, that's where it's gonna get the most abuse. But here, I think if we keep it as an alternate, and I agree, it's obviously better, but it costs more. So I think that would be my 2 cents.
Is the current product at Marathon bubbling sort of in the middle or near the edges?
Yes.
And that's concerning. It's not that long, and this is gonna be a
Yeah.
highly trafficked school.
The difference between the two products, the product that Perkins is suggesting is a manufactured board.
Okay.
So you manufacture the board and then you place it in the space. The product at Marathon is manufactured as a sheet, so it's just the cover layer, and then you glue it in place within the location. That particular material doesn't breathe well, and so that's why, particularly in humid environments, you can have some adhesive failure as moisture gets trapped behind there and breaks down some of that adhesive. And also, people pick at it. So the edges can get picked at by, I don't know why a first grader would be picking at something that doesn't make any sense, but that's where the difference in material between what Marathon has and what is being proposed.
So in the case of Marathon, I don't know what you're actually gonna do, but can you repair with new adhesive, or is it a replace when there's bubbling?
We're kind of looking at what those options may be now. We walked with our architect, DRA, who did the original design of that building, and he's looking into that. Judd Christopher
And
is
in this,
looking into that for us.
this would be a replace. Like if something goes awry here because it's a manufactured board, it would be a replace, right?
Most likely, yes.
I have a question as well about just the cleaning. To me, it seems like tile would be an easier like wipe if there is like kids are kids. Like they put their foot on the wall as they wait, they lean, they pick at things. I don't love the idea of having that. I think you said there's just like a metal piece that would connect the wainscoting that part, because as soon as something does come off, they do pick at it, and that would include that metal piece. Seen it happen actually. So, my thinking is if this would help the building for the next 50 years, right? Like we're building this building to stand the test of time and not need repairs after 5 years. It seems to me it's probably easier to clean and better upholding over time. So why not put an additional cost here, and then it would lessen maybe the maintenance cost over time. But I don't know if it's easier to clean. I guess that's my ultimate question.
I think cleanability is relatively easy on both. Yeah, I think it's really just kind of the bubbling and the picking that becomes a concern. We do have the metal, that kind of aluminum trim in the Marathon School now, and that's held up surprisingly well. Because I think we had trouble with that when we were in design of that product. Yeah, I think to Mike and Jeff's point both, I think it's something that we kind of just keep an eye on as we're going through our budget. And if we're able to make that upgrade, budget-wise, I think it would make sense to do so.
Well, I understand it's a newer product, 10 years, it sounds like. There's a building you're aware of that has it for 10 years. Is there an estimate from the manufacturer what the replacement or the life cycle is of that product?
We can find that out. I don't know it offhand.
I'm just thinking, doing the math, we're looking at 144,000 upgrading to tile. How many times could we replace this product before we spend 144,000? Is it 5 times, 10 times, or maybe that's just another way to kind of look at it once we get that number.
Yeah, I definitely, of the things we've talked about, this seems like one that would bubble to the top of my list of folding in personally.
Agreed.
Yeah.
One
I agree.
quick question I had was aesthetics wise, is there a significant difference between the two?
I can say that compared to porcelain tile, that product as well as this one come in a lot of varieties and natural looks. They're aesthetically very pleasing, and that's true of porcelain tile too. It's not just a flat color; they come in a kind of a grain.
Thank you. And the follow-up is the additional cost, it's for the entire replacement? Like the total,
It would be to replace all the areas where that product was provided and make it so that all of the wainscot would be tile.
got it.
My understanding was that was classroom wings, every floor, as well as the third floor kind of main spine. So the community areas were considered the main floor that connects the gym and the CAF, everything along the way, as well as one floor up.
From an aesthetics perspective, so I appreciate the look and the sort of look and feel, because we're doing the tile in the public lobby areas and then changing to this in the classroom wings, will that be like, is that aesthetically?
You'll be traversing a threshold, right? There'll be, the wings will be able to be closed off at night.
But the
so
consistency of look across the building won't be.
it's
that
not gonna
was
be stark,
something.
I mean.
It's not gonna look the same as
stark.
tile.
You're
It's not gonna look stark,
yeah,
okay.
Not stepping in, out of a school and into a prison just by opening a door, like, it's not gonna be that.
Yeah, not making it look like a prison is a standard that we really want to try to achieve.
It won't seem unusual, it won't
Okay.
seem like back of house. It's a different zone. When you get into the classroom wings, those are neighborhoods of learning, so it will make sense. And there's other materials and colors that will tie the entire school.
Yeah, I would also just mention that I think our hallways are going to be used a little differently than what we have in our schools now. We've talked about making our hallways additional learning space. So there will be more than just children walking down the halls, you know, it'll be used as space. So just something to keep in mind as we go forward too.
You're bumping me right into tile.
Yeah,
This is
It's not my intent.
yeah, I mean, honestly, like, I sort of see I see the wisdom in keeping this, in holding on to this and putting it in as an alternate in the future, but it also seems like there are a lot of really, really valid reasons to put it in now from a use and life perspective. We've had, I mean, I think we've done a really, really diligent job of cutting cost in areas where there was value to cutting cost. And yeah, I'm pretty close to convinced that we should probably put this one back in personally.
Well, when we looked at those options a few weeks ago, what was the life expectancy of the tile? Is it the life of the school? Is that, or is that,
Yeah, it was 40 years, wasn't it, the tile? I can pull it up.
Yeah, there's some maintenance potentially on the joints, the grout.
obviously, depends what type of tile you're putting in there, but I just don't remember, was it a 20, 30, or 40 year? Again, going back to that whole comparison thing, so I think it's obvious we want to put this, a little star on this one and look at it a little closer.
So maybe if we can collect some of that information,
Okay.
going into next week. But let's, again, similarly on this one, let's make sure this one gets discussed next week before we finalize, is that, we think
Yeah.
that's fair?
Yes, and if there's any way that you could bring us a small piece to
Yeah.
actually
Yeah,
see,
that
it would be great.
Before we close out, did anyone else have any thoughts, or? Good. Okay.
So alternate number 6 is our first site alternate. As part of the overall design of the site, there is an overflow parking lot that was identified next to the PE fields. So this would be as you come in from either of the two entrances and approach the Rotary if you're coming from Marathon, or go past the Rotary if you're coming from Hayden Row, there was a parking area that could be used for the times when the number of folks at school, you know, back to school night or something, where you'd need additional parking at the school. The design itself proposes to use a stabilized grass product, and what that is it's a plastic product that is applied, dirt is then put over it, and grass is planted in it, and it serves to stabilize the ground so that if vehicles are occasionally parking on it, it doesn't ruin the surface. There is an upgrade potentially that is more of a concrete paver. It's an open lattice concrete paver. It fulfills the same intent, but it's a lot more durable. The plastic, if it was, say, caught by a snowplow, would come up as a large unit, whereas the pavers are a little more forgiving if you have to clear snow from that area. The snow clearing being the most intense durability use for that product. The alternative would be to accept that this is a parking lot and not try and make it look like grass. And in that case, you would just lay down dense grade like you would for any parking area, and you could do a compacted stone dust or similar pervious topping, and it would just look like a dirt lot essentially, or a nice stone dust lot. And it would look like that all the time. To go to the upgrade to the pavers was a $397,114 upgrade, so additional cost. to step down to a dense grade lot with stone dust would be a savings of $223,707.
And it would be hard packed enough that plowing would not disturb it
Like all,
as
Well, I
much
mean-
as a grass.
Depends on how big your plow is and how hard, you know, how
Well, what would they
how far
be
you drop
using,
the
Tim,
blade,
in an
but-
area like this?
I mean, the end of the day, there's some maintenance with any of them, right?
So you-
More of a bucket or a big plow?
They use it like a lot on golf courses, where they wanna get fire trucks to certain places. The trucks can actually drive on this stuff like it was a road, but it looks like grass. The problem is, it's hard, like concrete. If you look at those, some people have these concrete things that are fancy shapes, they make walls out of them. Take that very same thing and lay it on the ground and grow grass in the holes. That's what this is.
You're talking about
That's
the
what the
second bullet,
upgrade.
that's what the upgrade is.
The second bullet, the stone dust will be fine.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm talking about.
The, and stone dust is stone dust. He's not gonna plow it unless he needs that parking, and, you know.
Yeah, I think in any case, I wouldn't plow it unless I needed it.
Yeah.
Typically, our, like, back-to-school nights are right in the beginning of the
Yeah.
year, which is not an issue with snow.
Yeah. No snow this year.
So, yeah, I probably wouldn't plow it unless we absolutely had to. I think for me, or for this group, it's more an aesthetics thing, you know? Either you're gonna look at somewhat of a dirt parking lot, although when we say dirt, it's not gonna kick up dust and all that stuff if you're driving through it. You're probably a little bit more susceptible to, kind of, I don't know, potholes is the right term or not, but like, some indents and stuff over the years that we'd have to kind of maintain to, to fill in. I've never worked with the other two products before, so I'm not sure, what the maintenance is on them as of yet. But I would assume if we're growing grass in it, it's just typical mowing and that type of thing. It does concern me with the plastic if we do hit it with a plow.
Well, especially
If
when
we
it's in
had
a
to.
somewhat remote area too.
Right,
Visually, you're not going to see it unless you're
yeah.
there on purpose.
Yeah, I see that as a concern too, especially if you're going to plow it and if you have plastic, and if it does get damaged, you have to replace it, so that cost may not be captured in this estimate.
I brought it up to Tim because on a prior school project, they had a similar parking lot like this that transitioned into the woods, so they went with something different than an asphalt. And they chose the plastic cups. They put just some rocks on top of it opposed to grass, but then the second they plowed it, they kinda sheared the whole thing up, right? And they were using it as a more regular parking lot, but they were just trying to change the aesthetic. And so that was why, I had them put these other options on the table of either to go all in with the upgrade or go back to something that's more maintainable and traditionally durable, like stone dust or crushed gravel that you would see on the surface.
In terms of aesthetics, the picture shows what looks like a line of trees around some of is there planned landscaping that would sort of catch your eye before you see the stone dust?
Yeah, there'll be landscaping along the roadway, so there'll be a pedestrian sidewalk and then a, 10-foot swath, if you will, of grass and with some trees, and then there'll be the parking lot and then the athletic fields.
And visually speaking, not to, jump ahead here, but we're gonna talk in a second about even having that PE field be higher than it's currently designed, which would probably have the visual effect of making this parking lot even less kind of obtrusive from that perspective. I mean, it seems like the plastic is not a good operational decision. $400,000 seems like a lot for those concrete pavers, and
Then the school in the future would have the option of saying they wanted to expand the playing field, find out we don't need the parking. You don't have to throw away the plastic or the concrete,
That's a good point, right?
because we're gonna have plenty of dirt, as they'll get to in a minute.
Right, no shortage of dirt.
From a design standpoint, if anyone had concerns that visually it's not the most pleasing thing, and obviously the loop road does go right by it, and yes, landscaping may take a little bit away, is there any reason why it couldn't be on the other side of the sports field? You could still get there through the loop, through the road for that excess parking. Is there any reason that wouldn't?
The
make
original
sense?
reason was that the the school wanted to minimize the walk to the PE fields, because you can see it's already reasonable sized walk today from the edge of the gym or the front entrance all the way to the PE field. So it was really trying to cut down an extra couple of minutes in between classes, essentially.
It would also add additional available parking closer to Marathon, because now that this is set up more as a campus, the fact that that parking is between the two schools gives you options for overflow at either school.
How many spaces? Do you know?
I don't know.
Yeah.
We'd have to look that up.
If I was looking at this, I would guess probably between 30 and 40.
I was gonna say
30,
40, yeah.
yeah. I think the stone dust makes sense personally.
Thanks.
Do you have any reservations about stone dust?
No, I think every couple of years, we would just probably bring in a truckload of stone dust, spread it out, and kind of tamp it down.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's.
Anybody
I think
who's
it's
had
kind
a
of an
gravel
easy
driveway, it's the
maintenance.
same.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was one of the ones that we recommended for that reason. It was simple, it was straightforward.
Sounds good.
So alternate 7, as part of the design narrative, the landscape engineer called to irrigate the PE fields and the grass play field area. In discussion with Tim, we learned that Marathon currently does not have an irrigation system, and it's my understanding that that hasn't been problematic. This alternate would offer savings of $198,240 to not irrigate those fields. The current groundwater level, as shown in the borings, was 2 to 3 feet below the surface. We know that there's wetlands in the area, and that seemed like a significant cost. So that seemed like a reasonable alternate to take. But it was, the designer had initially recommended it, so we wanted to put that discussion before the committee.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just mention about the Marathon School. So I think at the time, it was part of the lead decision not to put irrigation in. What we decided to do was put the infrastructure in, should we want to put irrigation in the future. I wouldn't mind seeing something
Same
like
thing.
that here. But I think even in last year where we had that kind of bad drought, that field dried out, but it bounced right back the following year, you know? So I think, you know, depending on what it is, you know, even though we'd run this on a well and not on town water, I don't know that I would have watered that every day anyway, just for the taxing on that well last year. So I'd be comfortable not putting in irrigation and looking at it as something in the future. We really want to keep this as, if it was a sports field, if we were designing it for, you know, the high school, middle school, I would probably suggest otherwise. But I think for kids to run around and play, I think not irrigating it would be fine.
So, 2 questions. I think you just answered one of them, but how much larger is this compared to the Marathon area?
Do you know off the top of your head, Jeff? I don't think it's.
Probably
Unfortunately, it's
larger,
just out of frame.
view. I was looking at the picture, yeah. It's larger, maybe a third larger, maybe 50% larger.
Okay.
You can get your answer.
I guess where I was going with it, and you kind of led into it, is there any potential that could be used as a sports field because of all the demand that's out there? And if yes, is that something we maybe kick to CPC to take a look at as far as putting an irrigation system in?
So I think we designed the field, and Bob, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, to go up to be a U8 soccer field potentially,
10 maybe.
U10 soccer field. So I wouldn't anticipate us ever playing varsity sports down on this field. I think, like Mike had mentioned, with the potential of taking that parking lot away and making it a bigger field in the future, yes, it could become one. I don't anticipate the school's need for that, so I think it would be something that we would have to partner with Parks and Rec if the need arose. So, yeah, I
Okay.
think CPC funds or
Yeah.
some other funding source could be.
Because it potentially could be a revenue generator, I guess is where I'm thinking, but that could be a year or 2 down the line, and I think to your point, let's put the infrastructure in now, so that we at least have those options either to, well, hopefully get outside funding for it, or other sources of funding.
Does the alternate, is the alternate, the 198,000 taking the everything out, or what Tim's talking about, putting the infrastructure in? How does that impact the savings?
Infrastructure is a loaded word. What I've typically seen would be that you would create sleeves under paved surfaces.
You got it.
So that, and you would locate them on a plan, so that in the future, if you were to run irrigation pipes, you would trench for that pipe and then run the pipe under the paved surfaces through those sleeves. It's not free, but it's relatively inexpensive, especially compared to the 198.
That's
$1,000.
essentially what we did at Marathon.
Yeah.
Except that we also provided a conduit from the energy source in that room. That we can run a wire in the future out to the pump.
Power it, yeah.
So it was just prepared for that. We didn't drill a well, we didn't have a pump. So, in wells, it's kind of a crapshoot where you put them, irrigation wells. So we said, yeah, this is a good spot. And, they don't take up much space, they're not giant. And by having that little infrastructure, which is chump change by all the stuff we're talking about, it's not a bad idea.
That makes sense, yeah.
And the final alternate that we have, so as Mike alluded to, everywhere that we're disturbing the existing grade, which is basically the illustrated areas of the image here, the process is typically to pull up what's the forest mat or the loam down to subgrade. And from the borings, we know that the subgrade is 2 feet, or the subgrade's about 2 feet down below the surface. So if you think across all of this site, in the process of construction, we're gonna bring up 2 feet of loam. We end up with a significant amount of loam. We do know that there are some other uses that have occurred, both from our experience with Marathon and also from what we know about some of the previous uses of this land as farmland. So there is the potential that a portion of that loam could be something that needs special handling. Not to the point where there's big concern about that dirt, but it may not be suitable to sell someone to put in their garden. So, as to mitigate that risk, and because currently without this alternate, we're looking at needing to dispose of or remove over 30,000 cubic yards of loam, the suggestion was made to, in the playing field where we already are creating a level surface that slopes downhill from one side to the other, does it make sense to raise that grade with some of that extra loam, which between the two estimators is somewhere around 7,000 to 8,000 cubic yards of loam in order to do that? And what that would do is you'd have a higher surface for that playing field, and there may be minor drainage things that would need to be accommodated, but you're eliminating about 20% of the loam you're sending off site, and you're also saving the money of having to pay for it off site for what is essentially just a grade change at the end of the day. And the cost for that is $243,000 in savings, $492.
It also reduces the amount of trucking, both on and off the site, so that's another factor to consider here. The more we keep on, the less deliveries we have and the less off stuff we send off.
Is there a fence planned around the playfield?
There's currently a fence planned around the playfield, yes.
Okay, because I just see the balls rolling away.
But keep in mind, it wouldn't be like you get to the end and there's like a hump. It would be incorporated into the overall grading plan so that we would try and maintain similar slopes, but we would, the target average grade would be raised up.
Is there a reason for limiting it to a foot? Can we go even higher?
We can always explore that, but you also, with athletic fields as the example here, the thicker the topsoil, the less it's going to drain. So you don't want to just mound up a ton of topsoil, because then you'll end up with that muddy effect where the water actually doesn't traverse through it.
I'm curious, Tim, are there any potential projects coming up where you think you could use some loam over the next 2 and 3 and 4 years that could help with this issue of not having to truck it all off somewhere?
Yeah, the only other project that I can think of is if the town decided to move ahead with the turf project on Field 3, where I think we'll need to truck in loam to expand that field and expand the track. That's the only project. I'm not sure how much that would take.
Yeah.
To bump out that other side of Field 3, if you can imagine where I'm talking about, where it drops off to the current turf fields.
The art of saving money on site is always timing, right? You know, you always have somebody with a need, but if your timing doesn't exactly line up, you know, then you missed your window. So those are conversations that we can, outside of this, certainly explore at the time when we get to that juncture in the project.
Is there a stormwater impact to this?
We discussed as part of the reconciliation that it made sense to include an under drain underneath the field. If we were mounding up that much loam, I could see a recommendation to increase the frequency of those drains because the soil itself won't drain as readily. And there's cost associated with that could come in down the road as the design develops.
Okay, I mean, I'm, I guess less concerned about the cost and more concerned about just making sure we saw a pretty extensive stormwater plan and that this doesn't undermine that, so.
It need to be engineered and evaluated. It does create a change to the overall drainage that was previously proposed.
What it doesn't do is it doesn't introduce impervious
Right.
surfaces.
Right.
So there would be water on top of it, whether it's at 1 foot or 2 foot, but it might change how much that runs off to a specific structure.
There would be no concerns of having to increase the sizes of structure because we raise this a foot. Like, there's no hidden costs that.
We're not adding any
seeing.
impervious soil, and we don't believe there's any hidden costs associated with that. It may change swale locations where you'd collect the natural runoff to go to, to Chris's point, instead of going right, it may go left, but it would still stay on the site itself and not change any water that leaves the site.
The advantage in this site is that it does naturally slope currently from one side of the field to the lower corner of the field towards the school. So you already have the existing grade beyond you is higher, so you're not mounding up and then leveling off. You would just change the point at which you start to level off. Part of the art and science of the question of are there other places or could we do more is you end up in a situation where you begin to either have to expand how deep into the existing vegetation that surrounds you, the natural landscape, you push so that you have space to put the dirt, or you create berms which need to be planned so that they don't change the impact of the stormwater.
Other questions?
I do have one more question. You mentioned that the grading around the playfield would be adjusted so that it's not a steep elevation difference. For that, to adjust the surrounding grades, do you have to bring in additional fill to do that, or?
I
that
think
kind of offset the savings, or?
We don't think so at this point. I mean, no matter what, at each of the next design milestones, the engineers will look to balance the site, right, as much as they can. So there may, this is not the end of the leveling. We may, a foot may be, 11 inches right down the road. There may be tweaks along the way that we choose to make because of new information as it evolves.
So we're gonna take that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the end of our presented VE items in terms of discussion, but the next item, is a question that the committee had raised at prior meetings.
So as part of our discussion on Friday, we were asked to identify the cost of the outdoor learning. We took a look at what makes up the costs associated with the outdoor learning versus just the typical site cost that we have. And it really comes down to benches, picnic tables, a single shade structure at one of the locations, and a little bit of additional surface. When you break that down, it works out to essentially an average of about $40,000 per location. One thing that we would note is that in the positioning of these near the recess area, it gives you the opportunity to utilize those if they're not used for instruction as part of recess. So it gives kids an opportunity to sit somewhere at a table for recess rather than having to find another activity. And for certain kids, that might be advantageous. It's relatively modest in the grand scheme of what we're doing overall on site. And so we're not treating this as a VE item, but because we were asked to identify the cost, that's where it broke down in terms of breaking down the components that went into the 3 areas.
Sorry, if we didn't have the outdoor learning space and those components, we would still have to put a surface covering of some kind, right?
As
Grass.
part of it, we looked at a change from about 1,000 square feet of concrete sidewalk that would become grass.
What's the cost to outfit the average classroom in terms of furnishing? Cabinets, desks, chairs, teachers, whatever teachers have now? What does that cost? Does it come close to 40 grand per
No,
class?
it's a lot more than 40 grand.
So, well, that's what I'm looking for. I says effectively, we have outdoor classrooms here, and we're furnishing for less than what it would cost to do the indoor classroom. I mean, it gives you kind of an idea. I know that furniture is crazy expensive inside, but 40 is not much for what the benefit you get from this. I think it's a smart idea.
The furniture is a blended rate over the building, we'll get into that, but it could be anywhere from $1,200 or $1,500 a student to $2,500 a student, and that includes CAF and other spaces,
Yeah.
but just picking a number in the middle, if it was 2,000 a student and you had 22 kids in a class, that's 40,000 right there, 44,000.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because otherwise 40 grand didn't mean much. We got 50 classrooms.
And I think this is a really helpful slide, because I think this, from a community perspective, not sort of understanding what we were talking about, I think this got away from us a little bit in terms of what this is. And really what this is this is just providing space for people to gather in any number of ways outdoors, whether it's kids at recess or whether it's an opportunity for teachers to do a lesson outside on a nice day. And it's not a lot of money. So I think this, I think this is a helpful slide to reinforce that.
I think it's also important to note, like, this is something the Elmwood faculty felt really strongly about. We had teacher leaders come on and speak to us about the importance of this. And those are educators using spaces that aren't even made necessarily for outdoor learning and using them really well. So what a great opportunity for children in our town to learn in this way outdoors with our educators. I think it's important.
And while the teachers were speaking about some things that could have been conducted inside or outside, there are many of those science standards that are it's so much more advantageous to teach them outside.
Well, and I think it's great, we're not creating an outdoor classroom, we're utilizing outdoor space, so I think
Yeah.
that's.
Great way to put it.
Well, I certainly feel like the Lone Ranger here. First of all, I'm glad we have a number, because I think it's a reasonable number, because I didn't have any idea, but I continue to struggle with a $22,000 cost for raised planters, essentially for a vegetable garden. When school is out in the middle of June, doesn't come back in till sometime in August, early September. And I've had people bring that up as well. I'm just trying to, in my mind, understand why it would cost $22,000 to have some raised beds. And even if the cost was zero, who's there after June 15th until throughout the summer to take care of these vegetables?
I also think, though, I think about it from a community perspective, going to marathon school on the weekend, connected to EMC Park right there are always families playing on those playgrounds, sitting at those picnic tables. Like, this space is going to get used as a community space. I think people will sit here and eat their lunch on a Saturday.
Oh, don't disagree.
Like, that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I don't want to discount it as, like, of course it's an instructional space. But I think, post-COVID, in a world where there's germs and people want to be outside more, and there's certain times of the year where it's more advantageous to be outside with kids, I just really think this makes a very big impact for students and for teachers.
The only thing I'm questioning is the raised planters for vegetable gardens, nothing else.
So,
Bill,
I agree
I-
100% on the rest of
How many
this.
schools currently have vegetable gardens?
They all have raised planters.
They all have raised planters.
Okay, but how many of them actually are there after June 15th? And how many kids are coming out through the summer and working in the vegetable?
Yeah, I really think it depends on the school and
Yeah.
the level of involvement with the staff of that school. So I do think at some of the schools, I know that at, when Mrs. Copper was the principal of Elmwood School, I believe, or I think it was Aiden McCann. He really took care of those raised planter beds. I've also seen some of them go to weeds over the summertime, and we're pulling that out, and they're redoing, whatever it is they're redoing. I don't think it's just for vegetables either, Bill. I think they're growing kind of whatever they're trying to plan to learn to grow type of thing.
And I know at Elmwood, there was a club that for a period of time, it may still be there in terms of the garden club that would be in charge of kind of refreshing those. And I know at Hopkins, it was a big deal too.
I'll end with this because I understand everything you're saying. I think to me, this is one of those perception issues that some people are gonna have a hard time with. Even though we're gonna have one of the most cost-efficient schools built in the past 11 years, which is a phenomenal statistic, I'm wondering, is this something that we could consider doing everything else, putting that off to the side, and maybe it's a project for the scouts, or youth group, or a community event, or some nurseries or landscapers to decide, hey, let's build some raised beds. I'll stop because I don't want to waste any more time on it, but I know this is a perception issue that is causing some angst out there.
So I think I hear you and I understand that, but I will say, I think there's also a bit of a messaging issue that wherever we land is the responsibility of us here at this table, which is, I mean, what we just went through is significant decisions we made that, quite frankly, reduce the sort of aesthetic experience of the school to make tremendous savings, recognizing the size of the project and the impact on the community. And so, from my perspective, completely understand what you're saying, but as I said, I think this is more for me a messaging thing, which is, we're taking on millions of dollars and making kind of the interior materials a little less attractive. We're staying away from that prison theme, but we're still making, I think somebody used the term Spartan to design the inside, which is not something you usually associate with an elementary school. So if for $22,000, we can give back a little bit of that atmosphere potential, and then we put the pressure on Mr. Broninger to make sure that they get use out of those gardens, then to me, I think that is potentially a nice value offset, right? We're taking money out because it's bigger, and we keep using the analogy, levers to pull. In this, if we cut $22,000 out of this project, it doesn't even show up kind of as a rounding error in the total project budget, and I think the value that it could provide to the atmosphere of the school, based on some of the other choices we're making, I think is worthwhile, personally.
The other thing to just keep in mind is what I said at the beginning. The goal today is, or this phase, is to set your budget for what you want to design later. And while raised planters might be what they chose to use to help set that budget, you still have the opportunity to shape it in the way that you feel will be most effective for the Elmwood community. And it's providing that budget that works out to be about $40,000 per space to make it the right thing for the Elmwood community, if that right thing is not raised planters.
That makes sense.
That was gonna be my question, because what I see here that's really important is this shade structure, so that they can learn, the benches, the picnic tables, places that they can actually do some writing, some learning, some group work. So if it's the planters that's rubbing people wrong, could we use something else and not use the planters, but rather really focus more on that classroom atmosphere outdoors, if it's the planters specifically? And maybe less it's planters.
Anti-agriculture.
Yeah,
Hey, I'm a farmer, and I've got a big garden, and I can tell you, I'd build a raised bed for a lot less than $5,000, so I'll leave it at
Think of
there.
all the loam we can put into those.
Yeah.
raised planters.
He's gonna come back all summer and take care of
The
it.
Elmwood raised beds, like, could we port over the existing Elmwood raised beds?
Shelf life usually not long.
cheap.
Yeah, I don't know that I would move the ones that are there. I think they've seen their day. I don't
So
think a lot of the
I think
ones
maybe we park the detail on this. I think it's a good it's a thematically important conversation to keep having. But I think we'll be able to get into more of the details as we get further into design. Does that make sense? You have something you want to say? I can tell.
I did have one thing. So going back to your comment about how we've reduced a lot of the materials in the project, I absolutely respect that. This, I think, for me, is one of the first ones where students and student learning is really at stake. And so that's a strong consideration for me.
Great point.
For the planters or the outdoor space in general?
Certainly the outdoor spaces in general, the planters, they may be a nice to have. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just touching on the other thing that you asked us, rebates. So the rebates are proportional to how much money you spend in some cases, or how much building you build. With the cost of the well field coming down, it does reduce some of the rebates that you would be entitled to. We reached out to CMTA to update where they thought rebates would be at. So we just wanted to provide you this information. Looking at the range that would be considered for the rebates, we think Mass Save still comes back in the $2.1 to $2.4 million range. And the IRA comes down a good amount because we're not spending as much on the well field as we were previously. So you're looking at a $5 to $5.9 million range. So when you look at this overall, with the three alternates that we had recommended, we would be around 123,554,410. That's largely the three site ones at the end, which is about $706 a gross square foot. Going back to what we said at the beginning about what Marathon's escalated costs would be, it's basically a building that's almost $20 million less than the inflated cost of 3 marathons.
That kind of goes back to the resident's question about if you built multiple schools, would it cost more? And so the answer is yes.
So before we jump into the total project budget, I just want to also mention, obviously, we talked about the work that has gone in to this, and, you know, the committee, and sort of coming here every couple of weeks and beating up these numbers. I just think we'd be remiss not to thank, you know, the Vertex, Perkins Eastman, the school district, for all of the work that has gone into answering our sometimes insane questions, but really understanding what we were trying to accomplish in this school project, and to drive these cost numbers down as significantly as possible, while, to Dr. Kavanaugh's point, most importantly, maintaining the most effective educational model that we could have in this new school. So, I mean, to look at this sort of coming down, I mean, $20 million below that, but coming down, I don't even remember how many, from our original at PSR. There are people in town who have suggested that this committee was sort of just following along with the shiny things that the consultants were showing us, and you know, these numbers do a lot to disprove that. And so I want to thank you for hearing us, and I look forward to continuing this process. But this is just really tremendous work.
Thanks, John. And so that's a good segue into the total project budget. So we're going to talk tonight about the draft total project budget. I'll give you a high-level view of the changes from PSR to schematic design, and then we'll talk a little bit about the MSBA reimbursement percentage changes. So the chart you have in front of you here on the screen is that the changes that happened since PSR. So that was in end of February. We submitted it, and so it was 176,000 square feet, 106. Right now, we're at 175,000, so it's been an overall reduction in the size of the building by 1,100 square feet. We're using PM&C's estimate, which is they're the designer of records estimator. They happen to be slightly higher, this estimate, versus the last one, or slightly lower, which was the opposite effect on the prior estimates. So I've grayed out AM Fogarty here for the purposes of focusing in on PM&C. PM&C was previously at 135.1 million. and we're now at 124.2 million before the changes that you guys just discussed. That was almost an $11 million savings at the start of tonight's meeting. The VE discussions that you just walked through, based on the recommendations of the project team, total the 665,000 number. And so that's an additional savings on top of that $10.9 million number. So you're now over $11 million in reductions since the preferred schematic in February to now. At that time, we were using a soft cost multiplier because we hadn't had all the design. We were looking at many options across many different sites. I had carried a 28.8 multiplier. Since that time, I've narrowed it down and dialed some up and some back. And that overall has changed to a 27.9 multiplier, but I have the backup that works into that. So that 27 is actually reverse math. So it's come down about 1%. And I'll talk about those changes in a second. But the net of that is that the total project budget before reductions at the start of tonight was a $15.1 million savings from where we were in February to where we are now. And after the changes that you've made tonight, that change is approaching about a $16 million savings. The multiplier is not exact over some of the changes we're going, but it's close enough for tonight's discussion. The potential reimbursements, previously back in February, we were targeting potentially being just below 45 million. The MSBA made those changes to the reimbursement percentage for the sustainability goals, which is good news. So that brings us up about $750,000 in additional revenue back to the town with some of those changes. So these are big picture, changes to the overall project. What changed on the soft cost? So previously we carried a 6% contingency, not understanding whether we were going to go with a GC or design build, GC or construction manager risk, and not knowing where the details of the overall project are. Now that we're through the 30% of the design and we know which way we're going, I'm very comfortable lowering that to 5%. 5% is the industry norm. If you were doing an ad reno, you would have a much higher number, but 5% is the industry norm. There's room to talk about that number as well further tonight. Since February, I don't have updated numbers from the design consultants for the furniture, fixtures, and equipment or technology. We were seeing on other projects a spike in the market with some FF&E over the spring months and into the start of summer. So I did tweak that up for the moment. But the design consultants are getting back to us as of this afternoon that they think the number can stay back where it was because of the scale of the overall building, because it's a per student factor. The fact that our project is large enough, we're not getting hit as much as some of those smaller projects were that we're bidding it. So between now and your meeting next Tuesday, I will have backup estimates that we will share with you from both the FF&E consultant and the technology equipment consultant. And so those will be actual numbers that we can plug into the formula so that they're not actually percentage based. There's been a significant overall reduction in consultant costs. At the time that we did the February, it was based on a percentage. So we've dropped by the $11 million, so that came down by that amount. We will have a proposal for you, as will Perkins, before your meeting on Tuesday for you to know, and we'll punch in those actual numbers for you to look at, not just a percentage-based breakdown. Utility, I've increased the back charges. Since the PSR, we did add the work on Hayden Row, so there will be some relocation of those utility poles, so that was an item that I did tick up. And then, as I noted, the MSBA reimbursement has changed. What that means to the overall effective reimbursement is that we started at the 44%. As I reviewed with you at the last meeting, we believe we are going for the new program, which is 3% plus 1. And Perkins believes that we will be able to get all of that 4%. And the state has assigned your reimbursement to the town of the 1.645 for the maintenance score of how you maintain your existing buildings. So that brings a total value of 49.645% times all eligible dollars. So what that means in red here, and there's asterisks associated with this, is this needs to be determined by the MSBA after you submit it. But what it actually means is your effective reimbursement rate, should you spend everything in the budget, will land between 27 to 28.8% reimbursement. Now, certainly at the end of any project, you're not going to spend all of your contingencies, and if you did, they're not likely to all be 100% eligible, which is why I've given a range here. the MSBA still reserves their right to determine whether some of the scope is ineligible. If you recall, we've made decisions like taking family resource out, we've tightened up all the little overages that were in there, but we're still at the mercy of how the MSBA decides to review the final submission. And so that's why I want to put a range. By the time we get to the town meeting, though, we will know the number, and I think it'll land close to the 28.8%, but until we have that, for the public's point of view, I want to put the range there, 27 to 28.8.
Jeff, I've seen you use language that once we come up to the final number here at the end of August, then we negotiate with MSBA. Help me understand what that process looks like.
Yeah,
When I see
negotiation
the
is
word
probably a
negotiate.
misnomer.
Okay,
There isn't, they run this, they run it.
It implies an equity of power.
that's what I was questioning, where we can have any leverage there. It's just they've got a formula and they just punch in the numbers, right?
They get a formula, they punch in the numbers, and then I argue personally on your behalf and finesse it in ways that I can try and, based on other leverage points, but they
Okay.
hold the cards. Right, I make case arguments based on other projects that they've approved or why this is a logical case. I was doing that today on another project where we were going through it and just discussing like, why do you see it that way? And trying to make a justification for why something is educationally based. And so it is not so much a negotiation, but a fine tuning of the overall program. Sometimes it comes to the justification of more so of what was kicked out as ineligible and why they see it as ineligible versus why we see it as eligible. And so that's the part that has a little bit of a playful back and forth. So with that, I want to take you through the budget, and that kind of concludes our presentation tonight, except for the scheduled dates upcoming. So I'm going to go through the budget detail now. This was sent out to you this evening, or earlier today. I don't expect you to review it ahead of time. We had looked at a early version of this last spring. And all these bubbles are in there because this is the MSBA's template. Off to the right here, I'll scroll over. There are many calculations that it is confusing for you to follow, which dictate what's eligible and what's not. It dictates things that kick into items that become excluded costs. It tells us what value to punch into individual cells, so that number, once I punch it in there, turns back to 0, so I know exactly that I've followed through their metrics as how they want this to flow through. They did not have a new template that reflects the new program here, so they suggested that I add that in here of the 3+1, and so I actually put that in 3 and had not changed that to 4 yet, so that could be even better news for your reimbursement. So we can change that on the fly here to 4%. That then calculates over, everything is intertwined here, so that would then tick up that percentage point to match what I showed you on the other slide today. And I'll go through the detail now. So everything on the right is just formulas based on whatever I put on the left side of column E, and to the left spits out formulas on the right. I churn through that and then enter it in there. You don't need to worry about it, but I just want to explain to you and the public that it is a very complex diagram, or spreadsheet rather. So going back to the top, your original appropriation at feasibility was $1 million. We have added some additional money from the district-wide master plan and then some money from engineering. So I added that 85,000 in, and then I also kicked that out as ineligible because anything that comes in as part of outside funding would be ineligible. That was the one change to the earlier draft that I sent you guys. I picked up on that error and have corrected that. At this time, the OPM cost, the MSBA guidelines is 3.5%. It's not an overall cap. It's for negotiation with you guys. I had it plugged in from a percentage basis of 3.3% because that also adds on to the 200,000 I had already done as part of the feasibility. I will give you a hard proposal to look at and we can talk about next Tuesday at your meeting. But I will populate all of these cells here once that's complete. There's the reimbursables for us, which is $5,000. Because you chose to go design, bid, build, there's no CM doing the estimates, so we're doing the estimating, so that is a hard number there. Miscellaneous advertising costs, permitting, so this is your third-party peer review, so you're gonna have planning board and Concom both review it. They're gonna pay consultants. Those costs come out of the project budget. The town's building permit gets waived and all their town covered costs get waived, but outside consultants get paid, as well as the fire department's peer review will all come out of that number. Owner's insurance, this is another one that dramatically increased in COVID. The cost of replacement buildings went up with the cost of buildings. So, traditionally, an example of Marathon, you used to be able to get a $50,000 policy for a size of a building like that, which if you tripled it would be 150, but those numbers in the insurance industry were not holding. So I've plugged in 250,000 here as a potential number based on some recent comps that are out there. That may come down by the time you actually go to do the insurance on the overall project. Other administrative costs is kind of a miscellaneous expenses, kind of slush fund for things that come up along the way. The designer of record, MSBA guideline is around that 10%. I've plugged in 9.5%, which adds to their contingency or their original charges up here at the 582. I expect that number to tick down based on when I get the fee proposal back from Dan and when we complete the negotiations with the Perkins team, but that's a good metric as to where we are today. Miscellaneous other stuff are some testing you may choose to do during design phase, miscellaneous permitting, other miscellaneous reimbursable costs. Hazardous materials, there's no abatement of the existing building, but there may be some odds and ends with the little home that's being demolished, so I left a little something in there. The biggest number here is geotechnical, geo-environmental, and geothermal. And so this line item here, although it's 800,000, it picks up 3 different types of consultants. So that's the full-time monitoring while you're drilling all those wells. You'll pay a geothermal, geotechnical consultant. You'll have a part-time monitor on site while you're doing all your foundation work through the geotechnical engineering firm. And then soil testing, should we pre-characterize the site, we will have to do some level of soil testing. That could be $100,000, it could be $200,000, or we could spend less and get away with less. It depends on what we start to find as we do all the testing. So those are some of the numbers that are that comprise that 800,000. I think that's a good number, but when I get the numbers back from Dan, we may tick that up or down when I see the Perkins proposal. Site survey, we had done the original, but we need to still do Hayden Row. There's still other touch-up work we need to do, so that's a plug number, as well as some wetlands work, and then traffic studies. There's traffic peer reviews through the permitting process. There's also a post-occupancy study, and there's other back and forth. We know traffic is an important conversation in town, so that's a conservative number that we could tweak down if necessary. All that kind of wraps up the consultant costs at about 13 million there, miscellaneous recording fee. The construction number is based on PM&C's number today before we just made those reductions. So you'll see that's the $124.2 million number that we just walked through. Of that, I want to pause for a second. The MSBA caps out, and we talked about the caps that happen along the way. So approximately 50.8 million of the overall construction number is ineligible. So roughly 40% of your construction cost is an ineligible amount. And so that number has gotten much better since you made all the reductions that you've chosen, because when we were at PSR, you'd already capped out on all these things. So all the extra money being spent back in February, the town was bearing 100%. So with the reductions that you've chosen to make as a group, you've reduced 100% on the town share and still maintained the MSBA share. So that's an important thing to note, and why the ratio has gotten a lot better with the effective rate, because we've lowered the cost to the town while maintaining the MSBA's portion. I did skip over the OPM and the designer one too, but the OPM and designer, of the designer fee at this plugged in number, if it was 11.8 million, about 2.7 if it was ineligible. And the OPM, if it was about 4.1 million, about 970,000 is ineligible. Sure. So they're covering 3/4 of the OPM costs and probably similar 3/4 of the designer costs. So at the end, the utility company back charges, I had goosed that up from what I had before because 2 reasons. One, the utility poles are relocating, and it's a very long run to the site to get to the building. So the cost of switchgear and transformers went up in the market, so the back charges correspondingly went up throughout the industry in the state. So that's another reason why we ticked that number up. I hope not to spend it, but we may end up spending it. Testing and inspection is just third-party testing as quality control for the project of construction. $200,000 is all the move management and other miscellaneous costs that come up along the way to get the Elmwood and Hopkins. Just note there's a double move here, right, because we're moving out of 2 schools into 1 location, so that is covered in that moving cost. And then lastly, before we talk about contingencies, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. The MSBA reimburses on a per-student basis at $1,200 per student, which is essentially of that cost. They cover about $1.4 million. Previously, I'd had that at $2,100 per student, and in the absence of having estimates, I increased that for this evening's conversation. And the same with technology, I'd had that closer to $1,600 back in February, and I ticked that up. We'll have actual numbers when we come back next week, and we can talk about that. Based on the feedback that Bob was getting today, he thinks we don't need to do those increases, but we don't have the estimates to go through the detail yet. So all that wraps up into the overall cost of $148 million, or $49 million. Of that, that's kind of more of the guaranteed money with the MSBA. It's not the contingency money. So of the $149 million, the MSBA will determine the ineligible portion, but I think it's around $57 million for round numbers standpoint. We deduct those things, and the MSBA tells us the percentage of the actual maximum feasibility grant that they would entertain. And then we add the contingencies. So the contingencies are the 2 yellow items here, and so or the maximum facilities grant here is about that $45.6 million number. As I noted, I just changed that by 1% based on what we just looked at, that I had not updated their template here. I had put the 3%, not the 4%, and so that did tick it up from what I sent you earlier today. So that bumped that up to 45.6% of the kind of the money you're most likely to spend, your consultant cost, your construction cost.
Yeah.
Should your bids come in less, should your consultant costs come in less, you may share in the savings depending on how much less they come in. So the 2 remaining items before we open up for discussion are the construction contingency. You're carrying 5% for change orders and unforeseen conditions. It's at 6.2 million, which is a large number from a dollars standpoint. The risks on this project are the site soil contaminants and design errors and omissions. You do not have an abatement and a demo risk, which is a more classical area for risk on other projects if you were tearing down an existing building. So you have a large site, and so there is large potentials for soil issues to grow, but you have a very healthy contingency at 6.2. And that's an item that, we can either choose to hold or discuss further. And then the owner's contingency is at 3%. Pre-COVID, I used to always kind of carry that closer to 1 or 1.5. But because other towns had to go back to town meeting, I've been bumping that up to 3%, and that's kind of what that is. It's kind of your reserve contingency. If you mentally think about that half of that is what you would likely maybe use, and then the other stuff is kind of the back pocket. And that's about messaging to the public, should we choose to keep it at 3%. But net, that means that the maximum reimbursement, if you spent all of the 2 contingencies on eligible dollars, you potentially could get another $900,000 in eligible added to that, and bumping that up over 46 million. And all this rolls up to a current total project budget of 158.9 million, which is where we're at today, before the VE decisions are made and before we get final consultant costs from us. I guess this is your ceiling, is what I'm getting at, where we're comfortable at today. So I know that's a lot and a lot of formulas. I'm happy to talk about any of these things in detail, or about the risk calculations with anyone.
Any questions? Yeah, I mean, I think the way you went through the front end of this with the summary, the VE discussions that we had, I think make it easier to understand this document. So that's probably why we don't have any particular questions at the moment. So
I think the only question I had, we had at a recent meeting, and Mike shared that with Marathon, there was a bit of an overrun when it came to the equipment, or I guess computers specifically.
Yeah.
So has that how has that changed and why would we not have that same issue again? Is it just a bad bid by the computer folks back, at Marathon, or, I'm just curious how we might address that differently.
Part of the Marathon issue is, it was after, a couple of tragedies, school tragedies, so a lot of the security stuff, cameras and all that stuff was put in that wasn't initially planned for. So that was a big part of it. The computer guru at Town Hall wanted fiber optic cable, which is probably the right way to go, which wasn't bid initially, so we did that. So a lot of the overruns, as I recall, the costs were at the end. And it was about and a lot of it was security and computer literacy, I guess is the word for it. Furniture, that kind of stuff, light fixtures, none of that ever changed. That was all planned for. They added a dishwasher that cost us about a fortune, but I'll forget all about that. The dishwasher's already in this one. But yeah, I think the cost at the end, we may have underestimated a little bit what the tech stuff was gonna be. And, we added things like at the time made sense, which are included in here, like safety glass in the first 4 classrooms. And that wasn't in the initial Marathon School budget. It was after the tragedies that we said, no, this is a good idea. So that was extra. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so in adding, I can never add more color to what Mike says. FF&E and technology, there are metrics of per student prices, and I think, back in Marathon, I think that was more the basis of it versus the more detailed, deeper dive. So I would like to do a deeper dive, and which is why I've been asking for the backup and trying to get that, so we can get that in front of Ashok and make sure it's the right number that goes in terms of the technology. Those two things change the most, and they're the last things you put on, so they're a little more susceptible to escalation. Technology is a forever evolving item, and usually it goes into a completely different generation of something. So it's not that you missed the mark because you were using an RGB data port. Now everybody's using HDMI or the new version of whatever that is. So over the lifespan of the project, you're setting the budget now. And it's a year and a half of design and 2 years of construction, and that's when you install the technology, different than the building, which gets bid in a year and a half. So you're 4 years out and trying to forecast what that technology is. So that's why we can carry a little more conservative number in that particular line item. And then furniture, you can manage to a budget, just like you made other discussions about that. When we get to the point of which we're halfway through construction, we'll do sit tests, we'll bring in some furniture for the staff to look at, and they have a high level, high, medium, and low ranges, right? And sometimes you may want to go with one that's a higher range because it's more durable, and those are decisions that the committee and the users will make. And so, we can certainly talk about the values of those points at that time.
Thank you.
One question, you mentioned there's a 6.5% contingency for the soil conditions at the site. Is that correct?
No, previously it was, so the way we dealt with the soil conditions is that we, I don't remember the exact mix, but we estimated a certain percentage potentially having to be handled in the next stage. The bottom tier would be that you can just sell it to anyone who has a garden, or a site contractor who needs a loan will just come and take it, or you give it away for free and it doesn't have a cost to the contractor to get rid of. The next tier is that you might not be able to just give it away, but you don't necessarily hit the concentrations that require that it's special handling by the state. And in those cases, you might have to ship it off to a landfill. They did have some material in the Marathon project that needed to go to the landfill route.
It did, I want to be clear on that. We chose to go there, so it tends to be, the Mass state law says that you can't degrade a site. So if you find things in your test, it has to go to a like site that has those same types of things in it, so you're not changing the makeup of the receiving location. And so there's varying elevations, and so, past uses on the site, there were different background levels of metals and things like that. They're naturally occurring in the soil. There's background because it was previously a farm location. So when we looked at it and evaluated those locations, that particular bidder owned a landfill. And so that made the most sense for them to send it out to Winchendon, which is where they owned the landfill. So it did go to a landfill location because it had items in there that couldn't be sold as regular fill, but it was not a contaminated site. So I just want to be clear on the wording of whenever we use the word landfills. But it is elevated. It's not just pure, loam that can be sold back to a distributor that sells it to the average consumer. So we've carried some premiums, assuming that, there may be pockets of that around the site, like we did on Marathon. And we'll end up doing some testing of the site to pre-characterize. We'll do a wide net early on and just see where are there spots, and then we then drill down on individual locations to zero in on where is it an elevated location. And then we can put that information out to the bidders so we get the best price when we're bidding the overall project. So we've carried some allowances in there. We've also carried some allowances for rock and ledge and things like that that may need to be addressed.
Do you want to talk schedule? So upcoming key project dates, there's just one I'd make note of that's not on here. Bill and I are gonna present to the Appropriation Committee on the 21st, just to get their questions and thoughts around where we are on the project now. It just seems to make sense to engage them as early as possible. Obviously, we won't have the final project budget at that point, but I think we've got a good enough direction. So on the 22nd, a week from right now, we will review the final project budget with the changes that we made, and we will vote to approve that final project budget. Immediately following our meeting, the school committee will meet right here and vote to endorse, we hope vote to endorse the final project budget and submission. So that'll be nice and convenient. Hopefully some of them will be able to attend our meeting, but otherwise we'll be prepared to do a short presentation ahead of time. The next day, on the 23rd, we will present to the select board the same type of presentation, final scope and project budget, and seek their vote for endorsement as well. Then we will meet again as an ESBC on the 29th to review the final schematic design submission, which we will then approve for submission by the 31st. We'll spend September, again, we'll use the word negotiating the project funding agreement with the MSBA, and the MSBA is scheduled to vote at their board meeting on October the 25th. In terms of a special town meeting, at the moment that is still being discussed with Town Hall, it's gonna look like either late October or early November. There's still some factors that are driving that. And then the only thing I would add is from a committee perspective, from about that August 29th date right up until town meeting, and we'll talk about this at one of our future meetings, we need to plan significant amounts of community outreach, which I think will include things like neighborhood meetings, really getting out there, not only the final details of this project budget, but also what the process is, so that people understand what they need to do, when they need to show up at town meeting, all of those factors. Any questions about that timeline?
Yeah, I'm curious, is there a set number of days that have to occur after the town meeting vote before the ballot vote?
Yes,
The answer is yes.
but I don't know what they are.
Okay.
Typically, on the annual town meeting, it's exactly, is it a week or is it 2 weeks?
I thought it was 2
I think
weeks.
it's 2 weeks. Yeah, I think it's the annual town meeting is 2 weeks. I'm not sure if that is the state requirement, but there is some gap of time in between the two events. My hope is that by the time we meet next week, we will have those dates nailed down. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Anyone else have any other business?
The meeting with the Appropriations Committee, is that going to be on HCAM as well? If people in the community would like to watch it, or read minutes for it? How does that work? I'm just curious.
All of our meetings are recorded,
Okay.
or have been recorded. I'm not aware we've ever been on HCAM, so I'm not sure why that is, but
Recorded from a minutes perspective, you mean?
recorded from HCAM, no,
Zoom?
it's Zoom,
not-
yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I was-
okay.
I was confused, it's Zoom recorded. So,
Okay.
yeah, all their, I don't know if they have to be or they just are.
Yeah.
But they typically are not on HCAM,
Okay.
so.
Maybe we can talk to Mike and to HCAM and see if there's a way we could do that.
Just
I think
because
that's good.
cost is such a hot topic and it's an important one, and that would be the place where there'd be other
That's a good point.
great information shared, and I think that would be good for us to share with the community.
Yeah, great idea.
John, on Tuesday, the number, we still have reserved the right to look back at that tile wainscoting, right? Like,
Yes.
That's not a decision yet, now that we've seen the full picture.
Yeah, I think we reserve the right to look at it both next Tuesday, but also potentially just have it as an item that we keep on kind of the VE
So-
list going forward.
So Tuesday's agenda will be to go through the undetermined alternatives,
Yeah.
come to a decision, and then we will confirm the points that we raised about the project budget. Also come to a decision on that so that at the end of the night, we're voting on what that
Yep.
recommended budget is.
Yeah, we'll get the estimator. You've agreed with the alternatives that were presented tonight, so we'll update the estimate and have that updated in the numbers, and if there are subsequent tweaks, we can make it on the fly, in the meeting and put the right number in the budget that you then appropriate the overall number.
Okay. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I would seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Motion by Bill, second by Shahidul. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned at 8:12 PM. Thank you to HCAM. Thank you everyone for watching, and have a good evening.